My name is David Henderson, and I'm making this video for the Clan Henderson Society. My ancestors settled in Beverly Manor and were among the founders of the Tinkling Springs Presbyterian Church. These were the first Hendersons who settled in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and their descendants moved out into Tennessee, North Carolina, Kentucky, and points beyond. These immigrants were part of the great Ulster Scot migration, which began around 1717 and continued until the start of the American Revolution in 1776. Estimates of this immigration say that between 250,000 and 400,000 immigrants left Ulster in Ireland and came to America. The reason for them leaving was primarily that the rules for tenant farmers in Ulster had been changed, and they could no longer actually afford to pay the rents on their properties. When they arrived in America, they found that only one of the 13 original colonies would accept them as immigrants, and that was the Quakers of Pennsylvania, who welcomed them in and allowed them to live in Pennsylvania and to work in Pennsylvania. Arriving on the frontier, the border between the Pennsylvania Quakers and the Indians, the Native Americans who lived there, they began to build farms. The Native Americans objected strongly to the influx of immigrants, and the Pennsylvania government kept trying to remove them from the Native American lands without a lot of success. They would often go out and remove the farmers physically, burning down the cabins. And of course, the farmers would just move to another plot of land and build again. As the immigrants moved out from Philadelphia, they traveled first west to Lancaster and Chester, Pennsylvania, and then down into the Shenandoah Valley. This red line shows the general path that they took, and if you look closely at this path, you'll see that this is the path you can take that does not require you to cross a mountain. So moving west to the Susquehanna River and then down the valley of Virginia, what is labeled the Shenandoah Valley. On this map, I've highlighted it in yellow. The mountains essentially provided a funnel that drove these immigrants down into the Shenandoah Valley and beyond. The Shenandoah Valley that they found was very fertile land. The Native Americans had used fire to clear the trees on the valley floor, and so the grass that was growing there was relatively easy to turn over and convert into farmland. But there were still trees along the rivers and in the mountains for timber for building houses. There was also abundant game. This is a map of the old Native American trails that existed in this area. The double dash lines that you see are Indian trails that go up and down the valley and across the valley into the mountains. By using these Indian trails, it wasn't necessary to cut roads, but the trails were narrow, and the only thing you could do on these trails was walk or bring a horse. And so the immigrants that moved into this area could bring with them only what they could carry and what they could put on a horse if they were wealthy enough to be able to purchase a horse. So imagine these people walking 300 or 400 miles from Philadelphia down into the Shenandoah Valley with just what they had on their backs, possibly an axe, a couple of knives, some spoons for eating, and maybe a few bowls. This is a replica of a typical house that would have been built by these early immigrants. This replica is found at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia in Stanton. And if you're ever in Stanton, Virginia, I strongly recommend that you visit this. They have reconstructions like this of a typical house on the frontier. But they also have reconstructions of what people would have lived in Ulster and in Scotland. And it's very informative to see what the living conditions were like during this period. Of course, as more and more families arrived and they needed more and more land, they went farther and farther down the Indian roads. They followed what was originally called the Great Warrior Path and then became known as the Great Valley Road. The Native Americans had a network of paths and trails stretching from New York to the Carolinas and from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The settlers followed this path. The majority of these settlers were Scotch-Irish from Ulster, who had originally been lowland farmers in Scotland before they were forced off the land to the Ulster plantation in the 1600s. They then came to the Americas in the 1700s and settled. There were also a number of German settlers, mostly German Protestants. Gradually, the Great Warrior Path was enlarged so that it could handle wagons. After a decade or so, there was a wagon trail that followed this whole path. In 1746, the Pioneer Road was built, crossing the Blue Ridge Mountains for the first time. This connected Winchester, Virginia, with Alexandria, Virginia, and the route of this is what is now Interstate 66. So as the population expanded and as subsequent generations moved out to find land, they moved from the Stanton, Augusta County area to Roanoke, where the trail divided, and many of our ancestors moved south into North Carolina, South Carolina, and finally Alabama, whereas my own ancestors moved west into Tennessee. Until 1745, the entire expanse of Virginia west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, all the way to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, were part of Orange County, Virginia. Augusta County was established in 1745 when it was split from Orange County, and later it was broken up into several other counties. So records prior to 1745 are found in the Orange County, Virginia archives, whereas records after 1745 are in Augusta County. So the immigrants that arrived first in the 1730s in the Shenandoah Valley had to trek across the Blue Ridge to Orange County to register as immigrants, to register marriages, and so forth. In 1732, John Lewis immigrated to what would become Beverly Manor. Lewis was on the run from charges in Ireland, where he had killed the landlord of the land he was renting. Evidence suggests that this was in self-defense, but the authorities were after him, and he was trying to disappear. So he moved literally to the ends of the earth, to the farthest point in the frontier that he could find, and settled on property near what is now Stanton, Virginia. In 1736, William Beverly, a Virginia politician and businessman, was granted 120,000 acres in the Shenandoah Valley that became known as Beverly Manor, shown here on this map in green. Beverly was to settle the land with immigrants. In 1737, Beverly asked John Patton, a ship's captain from Ulster, to bring immigrants to Beverly Manor. Patton is thought to have brought multiple shiploads of immigrants and also recruited them from Pennsylvania to come down the valley. Patton was also a somewhat unsavory character, sometimes thought to be more of a pirate than a businessman, and definitely a smuggler. It is reasonable to assume that many of the Ulster Scots, including our Henderson ancestors in Beverly Manor, may have come with John Patton. Beverly also asked John Lewis to recruit immigrants and sell land. Beverly's ownership on the land was contingent on him filling it with people. Adjacent to Beverly Manor and further south in the valley was another large tract known as the Borden Grant. That's the one shown in tan. There were only one or two Henderson families in the Borden Grant. One thing I find interesting is that the boundary between these two land grants is essentially the watershed between the Shenandoah River, which drains Beverly Manor, and the James River, which drains the Borden Grant and flows to Richmond. This suggests to me that there had been fairly accurate surveys taken by the time in 1736 when the land grants were made. This is an ad that was placed in a Dublin newspaper by James Patton to recruit immigrants. I know you can't read it, but basically this is recruiting immigrants from Ulster and from Scotland to go on his ship and go to America. He notes that those who can't afford to pay their fare can travel as indentured servants. Normally, the indentured servants who arrived in Philadelphia worked for 5 to 7 years to pay for their passage, and at the end of the service, they were given a horse, some tools, and a small amount of money so that they could move west and start a farm. Beverly eventually convinced the people who had set up shop in Beverly Manor that they should really pay him a nominal fee to get a deed to the land where they had settled. One can safely assume, I think, that most of the initial owners had already settled their land before they officially purchased it. So getting a deed from William Beverly would allow you to sell your land, but you can't use the dates of these deeds as an indication of exactly when people arrived in Beverly Manor. The value of these properties increased rather dramatically in some cases. My ancestor, Samuel Henderson, purchased 256 acres in 1746 from George Hutchinson. George Hutchinson had purchased this land from William Beverly in 1738. Samuel bought the 256 acres in 1746 for £8, and he sold it 10 years later for £166. Not all of the property sales show this much of an increase, so we have to assume that Samuel must have improved the property. Now, for the circles, the red circles are Henderson properties, and I want to zoom in on this map and show you a little more detail. In the northern section of Beverly Manor, the two red circles, the one on the left is John Henderson, who purchased his land in 1747. The one on the upper right is James Henderson, who purchased the land in 1749. And the blue circle in the middle is the property of John Lewis, who, of course, as we said, settled there in 1732 and purchased his land in 1736. The lower red circle is the property of George Hutchinson, and this property was bought by Samuel Henderson and Alexander Henderson in 1746. Hutchinson owned 512 acres, and Samuel took half, and Alexander took half. In the southern part of Beverly Manor, we find some additional Henderson holdings. The large circle on the left encompasses the land of Thomas Henderson and William Henderson. Thomas Henderson was a very early immigrant. The date shown here is 1738. William Henderson somewhat later, 1747. The circle adjacent to the William Henderson property, which was not a Henderson property when this map was drawn, was land that was purchased by Samuel Henderson in the 1750s when he sold his original purchase and came down to live next to William and Thomas. And down on the right at the bottom, we have the property of David Henderson, which was purchased in 1749. Again, the blue circle is James Patterson's land, and we've talked about James Patterson, listed here at 1749. And the tan church icon there shows the approximate location of Tinkling Springs Presbyterian Church. We're going to talk about that a bit shortly. The Ulster Scots were Presbyterians, and the church, the Presbyterian church, was eager to supply them with pastors. The people were eager as well because this would allow them to easily get married and baptized and without having to go over to Orange County. Reverend John Anderson, a Presbyterian minister, traveled down the Shenandoah Valley in 1738, and he preached in the home of John Lewis over by Stanton to 11 families. After that, John Craig, who had studied divinity in Edinburgh, agreed to supply the area as a minister in 1739 to 1740. In the spring of 1740, Reverend Craig felt the call to be the minister in this area full time. By that time, the number of people attending had grown to 37 families, and Tinkling Springs was the center of the farming families in the area. So these families, under the guidance of John Craig, formed the Tinkling Springs Presbyterian Church. Now, the Tinkling Springs Presbyterian Church is an example of the old adage that the lower the stakes, the more vicious the politics. This applies to things like churches and PTAs. There was an immediate conflict at Tinkling Springs between James Patton and John Lewis about where to locate the church. Their ongoing conflict made Reverend Craig's life difficult for years. The internal strife really didn't end until John Patton was killed in a battle with the Indians at the beginning of the French and Indian War in 1756. John Craig's initial call was to two churches, Tinkling Springs and the Stone Church in Stanton. The two congregations could hardly have been more different, right down to the materials of construction. Tinkling Springs was a wooden church filled with contentious people, whereas the Stone Church in Augusta was much more harmonious. This is a replica of the first church built at Tinkling Springs. It was a log building, 24 feet by 50 feet, located about 30 yards northeast of the Tinkling Springs spring. There were doors on each end, and the pulpit was in the middle. There was also a separate retiring house. The retiring house was provided for people who needed a respite from the lengthy day-long services in the unheated church building. The retiring house had a fire and could be used for nursing mothers, for committee meetings, and for meals during the all-day service. We know from Reverend Craig's writings that the church was half-built on Sunday, April 14th, 1745. He wrote, "This being the first day we meet at the contentious meeting house, about half-built." He later described the church members in these words, "Their leaders, proud, self-interested, contentious, and ungovernable, all of them, closed-handed about providing necessary things for pious or religious uses." From the very beginning, the Tinkling Springs congregation had difficulty with money. It was hard to get people to pay the amounts they had agreed to when the initial church was founded. Reverend Craig was often not paid his salary. At one point, things became so strained that Reverend Craig filed a civil suit against Tinkling Springs Church in Augusta County Court for non-payment of his wages. The church resorted to charging a fee for benches in the church. The annual fee was around £1 for each bench. The closer ones went for a higher fee than the middle benches, as you can see here. However, in a true Presbyterian tradition, they were actually able to charge more for the very back row as well. As someone who grew up in the Presbyterian church, the back benches were always full. Now, the Hendersons were active in the Tinkling Springs Church from its inception. William, Samuel, and Alexander Henderson are mentioned in the church's records in 1744 as being assessed 12 shillings to build the church building. The exact relationship between these three families is unknown. Two other families, James Henderson and John Henderson, were also early settlers, but since they lived near Stanton, they may well have been part of the Stone Church. Wills indicate that James, Samuel, John, and William were all brothers. and Samuel and Alexander bought a farm to divide between them, so there must have been some relationship. All these men were farmers. This is a monument at the Tinkling Springs Presbyterian Church, which is dedicated to the memory of the immigrants. And you'll see on the list, I've blown up certain parts of this monument, and you can see the name of William Henderson, Alexander Henderson, and Samuel Henderson are listed among the people on this monument. In addition to his call to these two congregations, Reverend Craig also traveled widely in the Valley of Virginia, preaching to families in small chapels and in groups and homes. We know that he baptized children as far north as Winchester, Virginia, and all the way down south to Roanoke. As noted before, Tinkling Springs was initially at the crossroads of a local trail system. However, Stanton gradually became the hub of life in Beverly Manor, with stores and trade, as roads were cut. William Beverly had deeded land in Stanton for the courthouse, and the court began operating in 1745. Court records through 1800 have been transcribed and are available online in Chalky's History of the Scotch-Irish in Virginia. Tinkling Springs remained a farming community, but the major population shifted to Stanton. As the population shifted to Stanton, the Augusta Stone Church grew to the point that it was able to support Reverend Craig by themselves, and he terminated his pastorate at the contentious Tinkling Springs Church and very happily moved to Stanton full-time. This is a picture of the Augusta Stone Church in Stanton, which was made from stone rather than from wood. In spite of its contentious beginnings, the Tinkling Spring Church remains an active Presbyterian congregation today. Its old cemetery contains graves of early settlers, and when I visited in the 1960s, I noticed it also has a slave section. Many of the farmers appear to have been able to afford to buy a few slaves to help with their work. The book by Wilson on the Tinkling Springs Church notes that a significant contingent of people from Tinkling Springs Church moved to the Abingdon, Virginia area in the 1760s. John Andrew Henderson, my ancestor and son of Samuel, moved with his wife Mary Russell in this period. His farm was sold in 1762. His cousin John, with wife Ann Givens, appear to have gone along as well, and several other members of the Russell family appear to have moved as well. The Tinkling Springs membership included 4 Russell families in 1765, but none in 1792. Several Presbyterian churches were registered in 1772 in western Virginia around Abingdon, including the Tinkling Springs Church in Abingdon. And this is a picture of the actual spring at Tinkling Spring, which was renovated by the church in 2008. The westward migration continued for the next generation of families. The children of the group that moved to Abingdon moved further to the New River region on the borders of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia. My own ancestors settled near Abingdon, Virginia for one generation. The next generation moved into Tennessee. Tennessee was settled as far west as Knoxville by 1799. My ancestors went to the area of Dandridge, Tennessee, where there were Presbyterian and Baptist churches. The children spread out in the areas of eastern Tennessee, and many stayed for a century or more. Many families continued migrating to Ohio and to the north, and down to Alabama, and from there west to Texas. I've provided a couple of references that you can read if you're interested in more detail. Wilson's book, Tinkling Spring, The Headwaters of Freedom, is a specific history of Tinkling Springs and the settling of Augusta County. The other reference I provide is James Layburn's book, The Scot-Irish, A Social History. This is, I think, an excellent history of the Ulster Scots. It begins with a detailed description of what their lives were like in 1600s in Ulster. It then follows them across the Atlantic to the settling of the Americas and the role they played in the American Revolution, which was rather significant. It doesn't glorify them, but I think it makes a really good, solid understanding of what their lives were like and of the impact they've had on the United States.